everyone, Professor I here. Welcome to week number 4. And it's kind of going to be an interesting one, I think. I want to briefly go over with you the document entitled African American Literature of the Late 19th, Early 20th Centuries. And to get to it, you'll click on Content up at the top of our course site, and then Course Documents, and then on this sheet. So this is the work that we're looking at right now. And this sheet gives you a basic overview. So very slowly, after the Civil War, educational opportunities began to expand among African Americans. So think about it. You have all of these people who have been enslaved, and suddenly one day you're told, you're free. You can go. Awesome. But there are just a few little problems with that. You have no money. You have no possessions other than maybe the clothes on your back and a few little meager things. You have no skills other than the skills you might have learned on the plantation. So, planting crops. Maybe you were a domestic servant. There were some slaves who had more skilled labor training, but basically that was it. You don't know where your family is, because remember, your family members may have been sold off. And so you may be a mom and you may have 5 children and you may have no clue where they are. And you have no money to get anywhere. You have no means to do anything, but you're free. So what happened was that you had a whole population of people who couldn't read or write. They were illiterate because it had been against the law to teach a slave to read or write. Why would that be? Because knowledge is power. If you can read, you can read signs, you can read maps, you can figure out if you escape how to get north. You can sign your documents, you can forge them, right? And so you can also read the Bible, this work that many of the Southern slave owners were telling you was the wording of God, right? The will of God. And you could read what that book had to say about how you ought to treat other people. And you could see the inconsistencies there. So there were all kinds of reasons to deny people their power. And so you had slowly a whole population of individuals here who were beginning to learn to read and write and to pull themselves up from this horrible predicament into which they had been forced. You had a rising black middle class, finally self-conscious, finally developing serious literary ambitions, because now, you could actually think. You actually had time to breathe maybe a little bit. And so you could do things like write a poem or draw a picture. But the challenge lay in reconciling this genteel style, this sentimental tone of popular American literature at the time that middle-class black writers often would imitate in order to get published, to the real-world agenda that, after the abandonment of Reconstruction in the South happened, obliged black writers to argue the case for racial justice to a wide audience that was growing, again, increasingly indifferent to them. So you had Reconstruction, and then everything fell apart once again. And so black writers found themselves in a horrible position. Were they going to just write what the white publishers wanted them to write? Or would they tell the truth? So you had a lot of social and political themes that were emerging now at the hands of people like Harper and Charles Chesnutt, author of The Wife of His Youth. And so the novel becomes this instrument of social analysis and of direct confrontation with prejudice, with stereotypes, with racial mythologies that allowed whites to just sort of ignore worsening social conditions for blacks in the last decades of the 19th century. It was easy to just ignore, right? It's just like, oh, well, they're struggling. Well, what can I do, And so, uh, so the literature helped to really counter these notions of slavery popularized by white writers who idealized plantation life, and oh, look at those black slaves out there singing in the fields. They're so happy. No, they really weren't happy. They're singing because singing was the one mechanism that they had to be able to cope. Think about it. It was the one thing they could do to express open emotion and not be chastised for it, punished for it, beaten for it, whatever. And so they would sing spirituals, and they would sing songs that had underlying meanings that the white masters didn't understand, right? Sometimes those meanings related to an escape plan or a way north. And often it was just a spiritual yearning that they were expressing through that singing, because there wasn't really much for them to look forward to here. And so they based their hopes on the hereafter. So this was the time that had come before, and this was the setting that we're into now in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. And so I won't, I'll let you read this section here, social political themes, on your own, but I will just say that Chesnutt's The Marrow of Tradition in 1901 is really a wonderful work if you ever have the chance to read that book. And it was reviewed extensively throughout the U.S. and it its commercial success was limited, unfortunately, because it did not speak kindly of white supremacy. And then we get to Washington and Du Bois. And so segregation regimes are taking hold in the South, the Klan, in the 1890s, with the tacit approval of the rest of the country. So nobody's doing anything to stop these atrocities. A lot of African Americans find a champion in Booker T. Washington, this incredible man, and they adopt his self-help autobiography, Up From Slavery, as their guidebook, right? So Booker T. was a slave himself. He was raised from birth as a slave. It's likely that his father was actually his own white master. This sort of thing happened a lot with the white slave owners molesting their slaves, using their slaves in those ways, sadly. And so Washington wrote a book, Up From Slavery, that chronicles his story. If you ever have the chance to read it, read it. You will not be able to put it down. I promise you. When I first picked it up, I can remember I stayed up all night long. I could not stop turning the pages and reading this riveting work. And so it's a classic American success story about how even the most disadvantaged person could attain dignity and prosperity right in the South by proving themselves valuable, productive members of society. And so Washington became the most eminent African American of the new century, of the 20th century. But soon he was challenged by W.E.B. Du Bois, who was the author of a wonderful book called The Souls of Black Folk. And Du Bois was a professor of sociology at Atlanta University, and he disputed the main idea of Washington's political program, which was the idea that voting and civil rights should be less important to black progress at this moment in time than buying land and achieving economic self-sufficiency. Those were the ideas that Washington purported. It's more important for you to buy land, to become self-sufficient, than to worry about civil rights at this moment. So Washington foresaw sort of a steady obliteration of racial prejudice and discrimination. He said, we can't just plunge in and just expect that all of this is going to change like that. But Du Bois prophesied in the opening lines of The Souls of Black Folk, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. And boy, did that turn out to be correct. It absolutely was. Segregation, as we all know now in hindsight, became huge in the 20th century. And it took the civil rights movement of the 1960s to finally bring all of that to an end. And Du Bois was really an uncompromising advocate of civil rights and voting rights for African Americans. And he asserted in his Souls of Black Folk book that through work, culture, and liberty, the dual heritage of African Americans, what he called the double consciousness, could be melded into a force for positive change in the U.S. So this idea of dual heritage, double consciousness, think about it. If you are black, and it's still true, but it was very, very true in those days because of slavery and because of everything that black people had been through. You had a double consciousness. On the one hand, you're an American, but you can't vote. You're a human, but people don't treat you like one. So you always have this dual heritage. You're African, but you're American. But are you really African? You've never been to Africa. Maybe your ancestors came from there, but you don't know anything about that culture. And you're American, but do your white brothers and sisters accept you? No. So that double consciousness really did a number on people. And so that's just kind of an overview of some of the main ideas. And the readings for this week are The Wife of His Youth, beautiful love story by Charles Chesnutt about a gentleman who was a former slave, but he could pass for white, and his wife of slave days who comes back looking for him. And just FYI, slave marriages were not considered legal, not at the time, because, again, if you are able to be legally married, then you can have children, and they can be legally yours, and you can have rights to them. And it gives you a sense of identity and a family and of belonging. And the slave masters wanted to separate families often, sell them off at auction. And so anything that they could do to deprive a slave of a sense of identity, of personhood. Slaves often did not know their ages. They did not know their birthday. Imagine how you would feel right now, sitting wherever you are watching this, if you didn't know how old you are. You had no clue when your birthday is, whether you're 16 or 20 or 24 or, imagine what that would do to your mind and your sense of self. And slaves' names were changed. So when they came from Africa or from, wherever they came from, they weren't allowed to keep their real names. They were given new names, and often the names were silly names like Prissy, Or, for example, let's say that I'm someone's slave and that person's name is Bill. I would be known as as Patty's, or as Bill's Patty, right? So I'm this person named Patty who belongs to Bill. So even my name would not give me a sense of who I really am. And so this gentleman and the wife of his youth could just simply ignore this wife of his youth because she's not legally his wife anymore. So this is a very interesting story. And then we're reading Booker T. Washington, the Atlanta Exposition Address. And this speech was made at the Atlanta Exposition, which was sort of like the World's Fair of its day. Very important, critical speech. And then we have a poem by Dudley Randall that outlines the two views of the men very clearly. And we have W.E.B. Du Bois's piece about Mr. Washington. And so in the discussion board, we'll have a topic about the wife of his youth and then a class debate between Booker T and W.E.B., which I think will be really, really interesting. Next week, we get on into the early 20th century with some works by Amy Lowell and Robert Frost. And this week, of course, you also have Quiz 2 on naturalism and Crane. So be sure and take that quiz. Thanks for watching. Have a good week.